In this presentation, we will define exactly what a climate change adaptation response is, and we'll also highlight some of the adaptation responses that have been identified in the climate change adaptation strategy for rural human settlements. The presentation also provides guidance on how to develop your own adaptation responses. To start with, the National Climate Change Response White Paper, published in 2011, states that the objective of South Africa's climate change adaptation response should effectively manage inevitable climate change impacts through interventions that build and sustain South Africa's social, economic, and environmental resilience and emergency response capacity. It outlines a South African vision and policy for developing an effective response to climate change and moving towards a low-carbon economy. The overall approach of the white paper is one of climate change resilient development, which incorporates both mitigation and adaptation response. The white paper defines climate change resilience development as all mitigation and adaptation interventions that contribute towards a fair and effective global solution to the climate change challenges, while simultaneously building and maintaining South Africa's international competitiveness, its social, environmental, and economic resilience to the adverse effects of global climate change, and any unintended consequences of global climate change response measures. Rural human settlements are identified under a key priority in national climate change adaptation efforts, which aim to minimize climate change risk and vulnerability to the sector through the development of various adaptation options aimed at responding to the specific identified vulnerabilities in the sector. Climate change responses prioritized in the national response for the sector focus on the following: education and supporting subsistence and small-scale farmers on the potential risks of climate change, considering that a changing climate may reduce the productivity of subsistence farmlands, having effects on livelihoods and food insecurity. Empowering local communities to develop their own context-specific adaptation strategies shaped and led by rural communities. Design and implementing economic and livelihood diversification programs, considering that the majority of rural populations depend on government grants and subsistence agriculture for survival. Prioritizing technologies to build climate resilience within rural communities. Ensuring that disaster management architecture includes the provision of safety nets for rural communities, most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. Rural human settlements are in many cases particularly vulnerable to climate change-related disasters. This is mostly due to rural households having high dependence on natural resources, having high poverty levels, and having access issues linked to the lack of infrastructure. The National Climate Change Response Policy also highlights 8 near-term priority flagship programs aimed at delivering the main objective. Whilst these address climate change and aim to deliver emissions reduction outcomes in various sectors and departments, 3 of these programs support climate change adaptation of rural communities. The Climate Change Response Public Works Flagship Program, that will consolidate and expand the Expanded Public Works Program, or EPW, and its sector components such as Working for Water and Working on Fire programs. The Water Conservation and Demand Management Flagship Program, encouraging the implementation of the National Water Conservation and Water Demand Management Strategy in the various linked sectors such as mining, agriculture, and water services sectors. The Adaptation Research Flagship Program focused on developing and rolling out a national and regional research program to scope sectoral adaptation requirements as well as costs and identifying adaptation strategies. The Department of Rural Development and Land Reform has also developed a climate change adaptation strategy for the rural human settlements. The overarching goal of the strategy is to create sustainable livelihoods that are resilient to the shocks and stresses caused by climate change, as well as to not negatively affect the environment for present and future generations. To achieve this, the adaptation strategy has been structured around 7 strategic objectives, which are supporting the development of community and local climate adaptation plans tailored to local vulnerability and needs, whilst also aiming to build local capabilities. Building local adaptive capacity through diversifying income sources for poor rural households and supporting sustainable livelihoods. Supporting sustainable land management that promotes climate resilience to the environmental impact of climate change whilst protecting natural assets by reducing land degradation and soil erosion. Protecting ecosystem services to rural communities. Promoting access to climate-resilient services and infrastructure to minimize vulnerability of rural communities to the impacts of climate change. Strengthening disaster preparedness and response to climate change-related disasters, and investing in long-term research to inform planning processes and develop effective and appropriate adaptation responses to support rural household climate resilience. Some of the responses included in the climate change adaptation strategy for the rural human settlements are aimed at adapting to climate change, and these include improving delivery of services to rural human settlements, improving and increasing accessibility to primary health care facilities, implementing HIV treatment and prevention programs, creating jobs through upgrades and maintenance of rural roads, installing renewable energy and internet infrastructure in remote rural clinics, developing environmentally friendly and socially acceptable sanitation solutions, as well as implementing climate-resilient rural housing programs, including solar water heaters and off-grid, mini-grid electrification. The Department of Environmental Affairs has also developed some climate change responses aimed at building the resilience of rural communities. The responses that are going to follow are particularly aimed at managing the potential increase or potential isolation of rural communities as a result of poor rural roads and increased flooding and erosion due to climate change. The responses included here are conducting a climate change risk assessment on informal dwellings, developing mechanisms that will enable vulnerable communities in informal dwellings to respond to climate change risks, conducting regular assessments of informal dwellings in order to identify priority areas for interventions to reduce climate change risks, making use of early warning systems that will inform communities of possible extreme weather events, developing community emergency plans that will assist with responding to climate change related impacts or risks, as well as implementing informal settlement upgrades. Now, knowing these adaptation options and having gone through different examples of responses that can be developed or have been developed with the rural human settlements focus, you can start thinking about developing your own responses for your area based on the known vulnerabilities and risks from climate change. When thinking about responses, consider applying the SMART principles. Think of responses that are specific by targeting a specific area for improvement in your area. Responses which are measurable or at least suggest an indicator of progress. Think of responses which can be assigned to a specific implementer. Responses that are realistic and achievable or given your available resources. As well as considering that projects must also have clear timeframes, specifying when the results can be achieved. To help you when you're considering these points, this table looks at a draft climate change response, which was developed in response to climate change impacts on vulnerable informal dwellings or settlements. The example looks at both good and bad examples so that you can get a better understanding of how you can effectively consider and apply the SMART principles approach. The response is manage increased impacts on informal dwellings. A good example of a specific project would be to manage 10 shack informal dwellings between specific area. You can use roads or area names as markers. A bad example, on the other hand, would be a vague example, like looking at all informal dwellings in your municipality. This is not specific and will not help you in your response. Measurable. A good way to measure this response would be to perhaps draft a report on increased risk from intense rainfall events. A bad example, on the other hand, is again vague and does not specify how the response will be carried out. Assigning a project implementer is important as the project can be allocated to a unit or department. Not assigning the project to a unit is a bad example. Aligning with disaster management unit KPIs is more realistic, as this increases the chances of the response being delivered. Not linking it to current or available resources is another bad example here. Lastly, setting a clear time frame, like at the end of the financial year, is more realistic than not having one at all. You will not be able to track whether progress is being made with the identified responses. We've now looked at different examples of responses and also gone through a table which helps you to actually identify and develop responses for your area. The next couple of slides or the next couple of presentations are going to take you through how to integrate these responses into various planning processes.